Hi, my name is Phoebe Ohayon, and I'm head of design and co-founder of Voice Branding. And want to thank the organization for inviting me. Really excited to speak to you today. And today I'm going to discuss some principles to a user-centric approach to creating an AI brand voice. And I'm going to start by introducing to you what an AI brand voice is, and then discuss four essential principles to design a user-centric approach, or in the design firm as a user-centric approach. So to start off, let me explain what I mean with an AI brand voice. So, as head of design at Voice Branding, I work mostly in conversational design, where we design for AI driven conversational interfaces. And traditionally, the term brand voice is used to describe the tone of voice in written content. So, it describes the vocabulary you use and in which ways you use it. So, actually, a writing style that captures the personality of the brand or company. So, when designing for conversational services and products like the smart speaker, the voice assistant of a customer service platform, or a new voice assistant for the car, you still need to write the content. However, the written content has to be a dialogue now. So, because of the interactions between a user and a bot or computer, and in this case of a voice bot, this interaction is through a voice user interface. And this written dialogue needs to be vocalized through sound and speech. So the word voice in the term brand voice becomes actually literally a voice that you can hear when designing for conversational services and products. And this voice is the key element in voice user interfaces. So you're all known with voice interfaces like Siri or Alexa or those from Google, but also think about the voice assistant fridge, for example, or the automated system that you get when you call a customer service number, or even in games. So these are some of the touch points that benefit of an AI brand voice that is automated and synthesized. So, an AI brand voice is a trained speech synthesis AI model that is able to talk with a specific vocal sound of your choice and is able to interact with customers on many different conversational touch points or even in multimodal interfaces. So, interfaces that can interact via visual, voice, and touch, for example. So, for many companies, it's becoming more and more interesting to train such a model instead of working with recordings of voice actors. Because when changes are needed, another recording session needs to be planned in, the new recordings have to be implemented. And you can imagine that a slight change of tone of voice can have a drastic effect and impact on how customers are experiencing or are understanding your product or services that you design. So you can imagine that an automated system is really beneficial and will not only bring the flexibility to manage and optimize the user experience if needed, but the automation can save a lot of time, money, and energy as well. But how do you choose the right voice for your AI brand voice? So, how do you make sure it will sound and talk the way you desire in the interactions with your customer? And how do you make sure it's actually being perceived and experienced by your customers as you have intended? So, this is what we call voice branding. And we design and define the AI brand voice while taking into account the human and computer context, the specific use case interactions, and the user's perspective of interpretation. So, how does the voice sound? How should it talk? And what are the user needs and expectations in the conversation that are important elements when designing the AI brand voice? And especially this last question really focuses on the user centric approach in our design process. And I will elaborate this design process and approach in four principles. So the first principle is about identity. The second is user-centric. Functional and emotional is the third. And the last one is all about ownership and data. But before we dive into these principles, I wanted to take a second to recognize the power of speech and make you aware of the unconscious effect of a voice when it speaks. So, who I am. So think about my age, my gender, my background, perhaps emotional status or personality traits, and perhaps even about my competence about the subject of this talk. So, based on all this information, you unconsciously form an impression of me. And a big part of that impression is not just only formed about what I say, but also how I speak and how I say it. So, despite the fact that we're all very sensitive to these kinds of signals and make unconsciously decisions in our daily life based on this, up until this point, it's really difficult for most marketeers and designers and brand strategists to devise a branding strategy to manage that brand identity through the act of speaking and to design that AI brand voice. But why is this difficult? So there's a simple explanation. Although we're all speech and auditory experts in that field, we do not consciously process all that information from those auditory signals. And this makes it really complex to actually understand and therefore to find these relevant connections on which you can make an authentic AI brand voice. So before we start with the first principle, identity, I want you to do a little audit and ask yourself how the company you work for now is managing this process. So how does the company itself represent itself through voice or through a voice? So what are teams doing within the company when choosing a voice to represent your brand? So what is the process and the strategy behind it? And just to be clear, this can be about choosing a voice for a commercial that listens and picks intuitively or just picks. And sometimes a shortcut is taken and a voice is already that is already been used before is chosen again. And I want you to you work for, and do you take into account the four principles that we're about to discuss? And I hope it can spark some ideas and improvements into this process as well for you. So let's start with the first design principle, and that is about identity. So, how is the brand's identity of influence on the AI brand voice? And how does this affect the user experience and the human computer interaction itself? So, let me explain one thing that is really key to this principle. The brand's identity is what the users perceive and experience. And therefore, the user's perception and experience is key here. So, what I mean by that is when a brand wants to be perceived as funny, bold, and charming, and when a user is offended because it actually sounded pretty patronizing instead of funny, the brand's identity is not being perceived as funny, but as patronizing, and therefore is not in line with the designed or desired brand values that you that you wanted to communicate. So, as a if a company doesn't change that and continues not to change that, you can jump all you want up and down, but that doesn't change the brand identity. And if this occurs on like a long term or a long-term scale or in a big amount of communication, this can really have a negative impact on the brand identity. And it's harder to change that persona or the brand identity or the perception that users have of your brand. Another great example of this is the results from a research of the Waterloo University of how the persona of Siri, Alexa, and Google was perceived by participants based on hearing their voice. So the results of this research are very interesting and show us that the perception of a voice can be interpreted very differently among users. Because I think disingenuous and cunning was probably not what Apple had in mind when designing Siri. But I bet Apple did conduct a lot of user testing on how the perception of the voice was perceived by its users. But perhaps the participants of this research were not the main consumer target audience of Apple, or because the state of residence of the research participants and their native language are also a huge impact or a huge influence on how they perceive voices like Siri or Alexa or Google. So these are some important aspects to address in the design process, especially if you are designing an AI brand voice in multiple languages and also on a worldwide scale. So to validate your design, it's very important to conduct user testing. This can be qualitative or quantitative. The results of these tests will give you a lot of knowledge on how your brand is being perceived by your customers and what they expect of your brand voice and what is needed for specific human-computer interactions in the experience that you're designing. So, because what happens if the voice or the identity of the brand or the message is being misinterpreted or misperceived? So, what happens when this disconnection occurs, like Siri being disingenuous and cunning? How does this impact the experience and why? So, when a disconnection occurs or when a disconnect occurs, meaning that users are perceiving values within the audio signal of a voice that they did not expect or need in that moment and are interpreted negatively, it has a drastic effect on the understanding and meaning of the full service or product, and therefore also the brand and company behind it. And for voice user interfaces, users are more likely to attract this understanding and meaning through the sound of your brand voice instead of extracting the meaning from the actual words you say. So when this disconnect occurs, you lose all on your efforts that you've also put into your written dialogue designs. And to some and to come across as desired, the actual tone of voice is therefore leading in the user interpretation for human computer interactions that are voice driven. So therefore, to summarize, it's not only about what you say, but for the most part, it's about how you say it. And to simplify a bit on the elements that you are able to utilize that captures the brand identity of the AI brand voice in conversational. And this is then we will take a look at like the turn-taking principle in the conversational design. And that is also built around the user's input, which triggers a response. So the system output always starts with the what, the copywriting, so the dialogue design. And this converts into speech. And let's call it, in this case, the how, the vocalization. And finally, that combination is received by the user, so the interpretation. So rapid technological advances in automatic speech recognition and natural language processing are really involving and improving the accuracy and value of that first part of the interactive conversation design, the what, the copywriting, the dialogue design. And this allows it to give you more ability to build more natural and complex responses. So, but if you only think about the what and not the how, the vocalization, you can have like beautifully written dialogues, really complex, and they all work very well. But if the vocalization is off, you don't get the maximum value out of your written dialogue design efforts. And this means you're not really capitalizing on all your efforts you've put into your conversational services and products. So, to close off the principle of identity, strong brands, therefore, create value through the sound of their voice and speak in a way that is perceived as desired. They think about how their brand is vocalized on the conversational touch point, but you can imagine that for other touch points, it's also really important to create that cohesiveness and consistency. So the second principle is about users' expectations and needs. So we've touched upon it briefly in the principle of identity as well. But in addition to how you have to think about how the brand identity takes form and it's vocalized by voice, you also have to weigh in many users' expectations and needs that are relevant to the use case of the products and services you're designing for, and the specific characteristics of your customers that influence their expectations and needs when they interact with your product. So, for example, that means that for one culture or customer group, it can be very easy to share health related information via a voice user interface. And for other cultures, this is a very sensitive interaction that needs a very different type of vocalization, and therefore another brand persona and identity um, characteristics from the brand that to make them at ease in using their product and using that specific product. So, to summarize, the user's expectations and needs are a big influence on how you design your brand persona and its vocalization, making most conversational services and products more user centric than brand centric. And here we have also an example of the KFC. So let's listen to that as well, and then look into the case. Um, and I wanted to have a look at this use case because I think this case is really interesting. So this case is from KFC Canada, and their understanding of the expectations and needs of their customers that come with having built such a strong brand identity and awareness over the years. So they created a food ordering experience on Alexa, and they synthesized the voice of their brand persona. And this decision points out that they really understood that they have to live up to what customers are expecting from their brand in this specific experience. So that they really understood that the generic Alexa voice is not really up to the task to meet the customer's brand expectations and service expectations as well. And also by creating that custom AI brand voice, it really differentiated from their competitors who already had a food ordering experience on the Alexa platform. Because if Alexa's voice was used in both Foodora and the KFC service, our customers are going to make a distinction. So, what is the memorable distinction compared to your competitor? Are are you as a customer actually ordering through KFC, or are you actually ordering through Amazon? So it's really important to define all these expectations and needs of your customers, whether they are from a brand expectation perspective, or is there a need that is specific to your customers. It can help to define these expectations and needs by a user journey mapping, but also empathy mapping. So, what do customers see, feel, hear, and think when they are experiencing your product? And how can the AI brand voice help to address those specific needs and expectations? So the third one is functional versus emotional. And to answer that last question, we have to actually define also what are the functional and emotional needs and expectations. And So you have to really identify the needs and expectations overall and point out which ones are functional and which ones are emotional. So let's take a closer look to one of another case of Boeing. And this is more of a multimodal interface, but the same principle applies here. So if we look at the FA-18 jet fighter, functionality is really key in this system. So when pilots give input via touch, or when the system gives a signal that the air pressure is dropping, the right functional voice is needed to inform the pilots. And I wanted to highlight this really intuitive voice alert system of the FA-18 jet fighter voice. And the pilots call her Bitching Betty, and she's actually the auditory alert system in the aircraft when something is much more important than a flickering light bulb on a dashboard. So let's hear the sample. So as you can hear, in really alarming situations or in more alarming situations than others, the voice adjusts to the urgency of the context. So when it's urgent, her second repetition is really intensified by like loudness and volume and relates to the seriousness of the situation and invokes a flight or fight response from the pilots. And to circle back again on the user's expectations and needs in mind, it's funny to see a similar use case with a voice assistant also implemented in a jet fighter, but then a Russian jet fighter. So this voice assistant is called Rita, and she's really designed to do just the opposite of what Betty does. So her approach is to vocalize calmness in alarming situations. So very similar use cases, different cultures, different user expectations and needs, and therefore different design results in the AI brand voice. So to summarize, it's essential to understand
Phoebe?
whether, oh, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just interrupting because I guess because you've got your headset on, that's why whenever you're playing, uh,
Oh,
it's not coming through. So that's why, when you play, maybe you need to switch off your headset.
oh, okay, okay. Then I will just skip those. Thank you for the note. Yeah, so to summarize, it's really essential to understand whether your brand voice has a functional or emotional purpose, or both, and when at which point it's important to change the tone of your voice to fulfill the expectations and needs of your users. So, the last principle that I wanted to highlight is ownership and data. And this is relevant to the design process, but also to the development process to create an AI brand voice. So, with the design process, I mean the process in defining how the voice sounds and speaks. And with the development process, I mean where the AI model is trained to synthesize your brand voice design. So let me start with the design process first and explain how data contributes to a long-term design foundation that manages the ownership of your brand voice identity. So, making knowledgeable design decisions based on data allows you to build a design foundation for the future. What that means is that you are able to make design decisions based on data you gather from research. This can be existing research, this can be user testing, this can be other data that is already there within the company. Um, so, this really helps you to create a strong on brand AI brand voice. So, base your design and the voice that you choose and how you speak, not just on an idea, but also on the data and results that you gather. So, be that company or designer that is able to exactly tell you why you designed a male voice, for example, or a female or a gender neutral voice, just to give you an example. So find these relevant connections and trends in your data and use this to your advantage. So the more accurate and relevant data, the better your knowledge is and the better your decisions are backed. And if you don't think about this, you're actually kind of designing in the blind, and you will have no idea how users may interpret and perceive your AI brand voice. So, and also when changes are needed or when changes are applied, and the user experience scores go from a 10 to a 5, you will actually have no clue on what changes in the vocalization caused it. And making decisions based on data, it enables you to also customize and personalize designs for different users and different demographics more easily. So, when it comes to ownership and flexibility in the development process, it's important to realize that designing an AI brand voice is a long term, cost effective strategy. So it enables you to build an authentic on brand solution that gives you ownership and flexibility on how you want to communicate with your customers. So creating an AI brand voice, as mentioned before, involves some speech data and speech data of the voice you want to synthesize. So you have to ask the question, who is responsible for that data? Who's the owner of that data? And these answers can become quite complex. And you need to take this into account, spend some time in the process of setting up agreements between voice actors, AI voice vendors who build these as well, or agents or unions that are even involved. So you need to take some time to fine tune these details into your process and take time for negotiations and setting up these agreements. Because when you don't own what you've created and invested in, you're not in control and you're not flexible in the long run. So own the investment, embrace the ownership and the responsibility that comes with it to get more flexibility and profit in the long run. And this is what I wanted to close off with in this last principle, ownership and data. And I wanted to take some time to answer some questions as well. I hope it sparked some ideas and thoughts on how to improve current design and strategic decisions processes in regards to the subject or in general. And if you have any questions later on, or you might want to ask these via email, please do reach out. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn and answer questions there as well. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Phoebe. I think we just have time to take maybe one question, and then the rest can follow up with you offline. So this question is from Mutoni. She's asking, how do brands pick brand ambassadors to market voice products and services? And then she mentions in Kenya, a local comedian was used to advertise the voice identification for a leading telecommunication service. Every time I use that service, I think of that ambassador with an emojicon of laughter.
Yes. Yeah, I think many brands can have a different strategic approach. So what you see now is that on a short term mindset, like comedians or influencers or people that are already known are chosen for like a period of a campaign or like a short-term campaign or marketing period. But on the long term, I think it's important to define first the personality and then attach one or multiple voices to that really represent that personality that you've designed. But it's always good to like have like these influencers if they really match that marketing campaign or that period in the brand's life that could represent them really well. It's always good to have them on board. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think in your session that I attended last year, that whole example of Colonel Sanders. You expect a heavy, kind of an uncly voice who would come in, and then for Siri, if you try to use the same voice, it may not necessarily have the same appeal. So
Yeah.
that was a good example. Yeah, I think Yeah, maybe just one short question. What is the cost of a synthetic voice, and what is the process for implementing it? That's another question that we got.
Yeah, so the costs are can be very different. So one of the tips that I will give you is really go talk to the TTS vendors, or like the text to speech vendors that create like these AI custom voices. They all have really different pricing plans, and really see how their structure, like technical team, is able to implement that in your infrastructure, because I think that's also a really big thing that needs to be functionally working well before like starting to design.
Thank you so much. I think that yeah, that's really makes sense. And in fact, we have the chat section and the question section. So even though we will end with Phoebe's session now, the audience members, you can feel free to post your questions. Just mention this is a question for Phoebe, so that we can pass it on to her, and then she can sort of connect with you. So with that, I would like to thank you again, Phoebe. As usual, a great session. I love this topic of voice branding. I think this is where truly the human aspect and the of technology comes together. So a round of applause virtually from our side.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.